Hi, I'm Randy Guy, Commissioner President of St. Mary's County, Maryland, and you're tuned in to MACO's Conduit Street Podcast. Whether you're a Maryland resident, a government official, or just someone interested in learning more about public policy in Maryland, this podcast is for you.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. This is your host, Michael Sanderson. I'm at the MACO shop, and I am delighted to welcome back one of our favorite guests from the podcast, Pamela Wood. She writes for the Baltimore Banner. She gets the Annapolis scene. She's on the beat, and we are 2/3 of the way through a pretty crazy legislative session. We want to check in with Pam and talk about what's happening around town. Pamela, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, really happy to have you here. And I'm interested in sort of things going on around Annapolis, sort of a little bit of politics, a little bit of policy, but also a little bit of process. And I don't mind nerding out a little bit on that kind of stuff. And process stuff seems to be a big part of the show. So maybe can you give a temperature check for our listeners who aren't walking the halls of the Annapolis complex every day? What's the vibe check here in Annapolis? You take a photograph and post on social media every day. I love that trend, but you seem to be in touch with the show as much as anybody. How you feeling?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here nerding out. This podcast is definitely the audience for nerding out over policy. But I'll tell you, it's not super fun in Annapolis this session. Look, the whole conversation these 90 days is really dominated by the budget, and we're recording this on day 70 of 90, and we still don't know what taxes are going to be raised, what or expanded, what spending cuts are coming down the line. It's coming down to the end, and I've just been anticipating this for 70 days, and here we are. It's very tense.
So I have to ask, I think you've done an admirable job trying to cover fiscal issues, which I think is challenging because they tend to be complicated for a viewer who doesn't follow this sort of stuff all the time, for a reader or a listener or follower who doesn't pay attention to the state budget on the regular. But this year might be because it's so interesting. Trying to write on a sometimes technical topic like that in a way a lay audience can follow along. I think you've done a really nice job with that. Did you ask for this assignment? I want to get in on. I want to write about taxes. I want to talk about sugary beverages. Like, how did that happen? Did you draw a short straw here?
No, I just want to drink the sugary beverages and avoid tax policy, to be honest. But it's something I've sort of fallen into and learned year after year. I really started learning about the budget when I was covering Anne Arundel County government and Baltimore County government and understanding county budgets. When you're the only government reporter covering a county, you've got to do the budget, even if you're scared of it, which I was. And in my time in Annapolis, I've learned more and more, and I'm starting to get a little more comfortable, but it is a lot to understand. And I really do my best to make it accessible to my readers who are, busy people. People have families and jobs and school. And if I use words like debt service or revenue write down, people are going to, nobody wants to read that, right? So I have to find ways to make it relatable and approachable. And so one of the things I did this year at the Baltimore Banner was a story that was my editor's idea. And he asked me to list out all the different ways that they could raise money, whether it's expanding or increasing taxes, online gambling. And that forced me to do a lot of homework, to read all the bills, see what all the options are, and put it out there in a digestible way for my readers.
I love that article for what it's worth. I was going to go out of my way to tout it. And I'll include a link to it in the show notes for folks who want to dive deep on that sort of stuff. I think your writing has been probably the closest the lay audience has to a North Star about what's out there. I think that was a good idea for an article. And you wrote it, honestly, I confess, I'm sort of a horse racing guy from days gone by where you get ready for the Preakness and you watch the horses and all that kind of stuff. And that read to me a little bit like the rundown of the lineup for a horse race. And, this one looks like it has a pretty good shot, and here's where it came from, and here's how much it does, and that sort of stuff. This one, it's been in before, didn't win its last race, those kinds of things. So I like the flavor of that article. We'll link to it in the show notes for sure. So this definitely is a crazier year for the fiscal plan overall. For context, for readers who don't have like the inner circle sense of this, in a normal year, we would have seen the first chamber, that this year is the House of Delegates. They would have passed their fiscal plan really in the first week of March. And then you would have expected the Senate to be passing their fiscal plan in the second week of March. And then the third week of March is usually the window where the two sides are working out their differences and go to a conference committee and then bring a final bill to both chambers for a final vote. So most of us old timers are used to a 3-step cycle. And this year, for specific reasons, we have uncertainty from the federal government and some weakness in the Maryland economy. So they wanted to wait until we had a few more data points to get the ball rolling. But we still haven't had the first phase of that. We haven't even seen a first draft fiscal plan released. A lot of informal conversations happening, but that's what's so disorienting for those of us who follow this is wonder when the next shoe is going to drop, right?
That's right. In a typical year, this process would be much farther along at this point. Where things stand now is the governor's introduced budget, which was all the way back in January, and there's been no progress since then. And as you noted, they were waiting for data points. One was what the new revenue estimates were going to be, and turned out less money than they had planned on. No surprise. They were also waiting to see if the federal government would shut down or not, and what would happen with the continuing resolution. Would Congress pass a whole big spending plan with a bunch of cuts, or would they do a keep it steady CR? So they wanted to see what happened there. They have basically all the information they're going to get at this point. So now it is this ongoing negotiations between House Democratic leadership, Senate Democratic leadership, the governor's office. We keep being told they're close every day, that they're close, but still no budget yet. And yeah, it's day 70 as we're recording out of day 90, still no solution.
Right. And I think the smart money is probably that once we see the legislative and administration leaders eventually potentially work out a deal and say, we think the House can support this plan. We think the Senate can support this plan. The administration's okay with the general principles and so forth. We'd probably see this advance more like an ordinary bill than an ordinary budget process. I'm guessing you're smelling the same thing, that once the conclave opens up and the right color smoke comes out of the chimney, that eventually it'll be, all right, there's a plan. And then the House will move something anticipating that the Senate will be largely on the same sheet of music. So we might not need that full 3-step process of we do one entire thing and then the other chamber does another entire thing. And then we work out our differences. Maybe the differences are baked into the first round.
That is sort of where it's heading. Senate President Bill Ferguson spoke to reporters this morning, and he said, in terms of timing, everyone will know when there's an agreement when we have a joint announcement, that a joint announcement being House, Senate, Governor, right. All coming together on the same page. That said, President Ferguson did allow that there could be some differences, that there may need to be a little bit of a conference committee at the end, but it seems like they would all come out, all three sort of parties announce the budget. It would go quickly through the House, quickly through the Senate. Maybe if there are some changes, there would be a conference committee, but not that like longer process like we saw play out last year in particular, where they really went back and forth between the House and Senate. It should be, or at least they're trying to make it, an agreement on all of the big pieces so that they can move it quickly in these last 20 days.
Right. So I mean, among the things that you potentially worry about is you just run out of time to get through the process. And there are ways to make this work, even with less than 3 weeks left on the clock. So let's hope for your sanity and for everybody's interest in predictability that we get some movement in that direction, and it happens sometime fairly soon. Down for that.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, any other issues around town that are worthy of note or comment that you've been following? I'm sure you found the same thing that I have over the years. Sometimes you may be in the room for one particular topic, and then there's a hearing or there's a briefing on some other topic, and you sort of catch the scent of, actually, that's pretty interesting. That's not my thing, but that's pretty juicy stuff going on. Anything like that catching your eye this year?
That does happen all the time. And what's great about the Baltimore Banner is we have a 3-person team down here at the State House this year. So often we spot things and go, oh, I know Brenda or Maddie is working on that. Let me take some notes and pass it along. Last year I worked on a story called, I called it the Strange Bedfellows story, where I wrote about legislation that had unlikely pairings of Republican and Democratic co-sponsors or cross files. And it was highlighted by a housing bill from Senator Chris West and Delegate Adrian Boafo. But throughout the session, I was on the lookout for them. My colleague Brenda Wintred was on the lookout. We had a list running of Strange Bedfellows bills working together. But honestly, this year I have been very tightly focused on the budget, number one, and the blueprint for Maryland's future, number two, and really tried to write about, those primarily. Probably 95% of my stories are about one or the other. And, those two are intertwined, of course,
Sure.
because the blueprint for Maryland's future education plan, that's tied up in contributing to the long-term projected structural deficit. It's funded in the short term, but I'm sure listeners here are well aware of the challenges of implementing the blueprint. So I've been writing about that a lot as well.
Yeah, I think that observation is important, that ordinarily the blueprint being one of the principal long-term drivers of expenses in the state budget would be a front and center part of the fiscal resolution to today's crisis. But we have this anomalous circumstance where there's the education trust fund that was loaded with some casino money and some targeted tax money for a number of years before the blueprint really got up and running. So it's been running a balance and basically has these extra costs paid for a couple more years. And it's kept these two discussions more separate than they might have been in a different circumstance. If a nip and tuck on the blueprint really turned into 200 or 600 million in cash for the general fund today, you might think that would be right in the center of how do you resolve this year's budget crisis. And instead, they're almost on almost completely separate tracks. They're connected in the long term, but not right now. It's a weird anomaly.
It is. And, I don't have a good sense of how it's all exactly going to shake out. As Democratic leaders continue to note the blueprint, there's still enough money in that fund to cover it for the next couple years, but they're going to need to address it long term. And given the blueprint, if that gets a haircut at some point, does that help with the general fund picture? And you sort of maybe would have to in the out years. So it could get back intertwined. I'm interested to see if that happens and how that plays out.
All right. Well, you definitely are focusing on issues that are of great interest to many of our listeners. Even though we've drifted into broader policy and politics, we do have an awful lot of folks who are invested in county governments. And as you, of course, have gathered, we're central players in a number of different elements in the state budget plan. I'm not going to try and lobby you or lobby our listeners, but as a practical matter, we've got a fair amount at stake that some of the budget balancing the state is considering would end up coming, at the expense of the bottom line of county governments. We'd have to pay for a new service or get a little less help from the state for some of the things we do jointly. So we're stakeholders in the state's fiscal plan, and time's of the essence for us too. We have counties who are already right up against their deadlines to at least propose their budget for the year ahead, or to start their public hearings on that process and so forth. And a lot of counties are just walking around with asterisks saying, well, we still don't know what the state's going to do and how much that upends what our plan A budget looks like this, but we don't know if we get bad news from Annapolis, maybe we lose another $2 million or something.
Yeah, it's really challenging how the calendar works. It used to be when I straddled the two worlds, I would go from the State House sine die and then directly a few days later into, Baltimore County proposing its budget. But yes, some counties already have started that process and they don't know how many costs are going to be shifted onto the counties as part of the state budget balancing plan. And, it's challenging for counties. Many are limited on revenue, can't increase the piggyback tax anymore, politically difficult to increase property taxes. And there's so many pieces of the puzzle. And every time they make a decision in the state house, there's sort of flow through effects in a lot of different places.
You probably noticed the same thing I did at both the House and Senate hearings on the big budget reconciliation bill, the bill that sort of rides along with the budget itself. The budget's just the spending plan. Then the reconciliation bill, we call it the BRFA in town, or Big BRFA, is the one that sort of says, well, we'll take a little money out of this fund, and for 1 year we won't do that's one thing, and this formula is going to have to wait a couple of years for its acceleration, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, dozens and dozens of pages of formula changes and stuff like that. And people testifying on that bill for, 5 hours straight, at least half of them came up and said, boy, do I not envy the problem you all have to sort through to try and figure out this plan. Because I'm here worried about the electrolysis fund and our $62,000 that's being moved in the BRFA, but somebody else is here for $100 million on this, and somebody's here for $40 million on that, and everybody's got a sympathetic case. But lots of people coming in saying, boy, Mr. Chair and your committee members, I don't envy the tough spot you're in. I think it's a widespread acknowledgement. This is not an easy situation.
Yeah, that was absolutely the case. I noticed that as well. Everybody came in with a lot of sympathy for the lawmakers that they were facing down. And the BRFA, that's one around the State House, we use that lingo. Everybody knows what it means, but I can't put that in a news story. So I called it the governor's budget balancing plan. Right. I thought that was like a good summary of, as you said, shifting the formulas, moving some money around to make all the numbers work.
Right. And it's, I don't know, some of those things just become old hat insiders. And you're right that you can't use the acronyms and you can't use the shorthand and so forth. So you try and come up with a 7-word phrase that can do a good enough job to keep moving along. Right. So,
yep. It's part of what I see my job here is doing is sort of translating all this government speak and political speak into what does it mean in plain English and how is it going to affect you, what matters to you, trying to be that kind of connector for my readers to what their lawmakers are doing.
For sure. I think that's a centerpiece to the gig, and I'm grateful that you and some sharp people with some experience like you have been doing this. You and Brenda and Maddie, working on behalf of the Banner, have been covering Annapolis and doing, in my judgment, a good and thorough job of it. We need that in town. I'm interested in the feel over at the Banner. I know you've got a background with old school newspapers and the smell of newsprint ink and smudged fingers and all the old school stuff. And the Banner's a similar mission, although maybe different means to get there. But can you talk a little bit about sort of like the esprit de corps and how things are working with the Banner, working with that team, and sort of the mission that you all feel?
The Banner is great. We're doing really well. I just celebrated my 3rd work anniversary. I started in February 2022, which is insane how the time has flown. And I would have the under on that. Yeah, it's been really rewarding actually building something from nothing into what we are today. Hopefully people see us as a major news source for the Baltimore region, covering the city, the county is state news that's important to people in the region. We've grown a lot. We're pretty big newsroom. We've got about, I believe, 85 journalists on staff, reporters, editors, photographers, copy editors. And we're really happy with how things are going. Of course, we're always still evolving and taking cues from our readers and listening to feedback to shape into like what's the right news product that people in Baltimore and the Baltimore region want.
Yeah, I mean, I confess that I'm a little bit myopic, especially this time of year, and focus very much on the state politics and policy and education and the sort of beats that land right here on the stuff that are right in front of my nose. But the Banner has aspired to a big footprint, to try and cover issues around Baltimore, around Maryland, and to get into much more stuff than just my small ball political kind of stuff. So I appreciate you all who are here in the state house beat and working those kind of issues. But I'm proud as a subscriber of the Banner to see the coverage you all have been able to dig into, and honestly, the talent you've brought to the Banner is impressive. You got every opportunity to make this thing work. I really like that.
Yeah, it's our team is really fantastic. Both the names that you see on the stories and the pictures. A bunch of us came over from the Baltimore Sun. We've brought people from other places in town. People have experienced it. WJZ, Masson, other newspapers, and also people from out of state. Some people who are working out of state but have roots here in Baltimore and Maryland. A really fantastic group of people who are really trying to pull in the same direction and bring this modern news source to Baltimore. And look, I can't say enough about our readers and subscribers. And thank you, Michael, for subscribing. They've pushed us to do things like obituaries. We initially weren't going to do obituaries when we started, and we hired a fantastic writer named Kayla Harris, who writes the most beautiful obituary stories about people that are just really incredible. And you can also buy the death notice obituaries, the pay by the word situation that you would see in a traditional newspaper. We started offering that as well. And that's because we got demand from our readers. So if anybody's a reader of the Banner and has ideas, hit us up, let us know. We want to serve the community. And that's what's really great about being nonprofit and locally based. We don't have, Wall Street or hedge fund owners to answer to. We answer to our readers, which is really, really very rewarding.
Yeah, I have to think. I mean, like that particular example with obits wouldn't have occurred to me as an outsider about where do you define the mission of a new media enterprise? We're gonna show up and try and serve this greater Baltimore, Maryland community and try and fit into the fabric. So let's try and do these things. But at some point, I'm sure there's an open discussion, like how far do we want to go into the realm that used to be covered by old school last generation newspaper coverages. And I'm like, I get the argument that obits are part of the fabric of the community, right? I'm sympathetic to that. It wasn't obvious to me until you mentioned it. I'm buying it now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't something that was on our to-do list when we started, but people told us, and it's resonating, right? The beautiful thing about having a website is you can tell how many people are reading different stories. All the email newsletters that we send out, we can tell how many people open them and how many people click. Another one, we had heard a lot of demand for high school sports, and for a while we partnered with another organization. We had high school sports coverage on our website, but it just didn't really do that well. So we let that relationship, just continue, and we moved away from high school sports. But, that's not a failure, that's learning, right? And part of being a growing organization is trying different things and seeing what works and being open to change, which, when you're at maybe in like old school newspapers, sometimes it's, well, we've always done it that way. Here at the Banner, we're really open-minded about trying things, and sometimes they won't work, but hopefully we'll land on the right choices and the right content.
Well, I'm as a consumer and also just as a stakeholder, I'm a big believer in coverage of the kind of stuff that's happening relatively close to home. I think gets lost in the shuffle and sometimes gets lost in the pursuit of a quarterly report. But I hope that both old school media and new school media and all the various freelancers and writers and folks out there doing their own thing, I just think healthy attention onto the policy process is good for democracy in the old school Fourth Estate concept style. I think that's good. I want everybody doing this stuff, and I want lots of people reading it and paying for it. So that's the version I want.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You nailed it.
So, any sort of like big picture observations about doing the work in Annapolis, how things have changed. I know you've had a couple stations other than the State House, and I'm interested in those as well. But like trying to take a retrospective after a number of years doing this sort of thing, how are things different, whether it's post-COVID or with so much more content being streamed and available live and so forth? I mean, the job's different than it was 8 or 10 years ago, for sure, right?
The job absolutely is different, and I'm glad we're mostly clear of the COVID days, and some of the changes then are still being carried out, which is great. As you mentioned, the streaming of everything, including voting sessions, committee voting sessions. If you ever miss something as a reporter, and look, we can't be everywhere. There's 10 standing committees, like there's 2 chambers, there's so much going on. If you ever miss something, you can always go back and watch the video, which is very helpful as a journalist to be able to do that. Or you can try and be in 2 places at once. You can sit at your desk and, juggle 2 different hearings. Of course, there's no substitute for being here in the complex, in person, walking the halls and talking to people. That has not changed. That's still the number one way to get information, is to be here in person, to build the relationships and have your face in front of lawmakers. Frankly, the more they see me, the more likely they're going to answer my call or talk to me when I, have a question about their bill or about a vote. But if I could add one more thing, you talked about this in the episode with Josh Kurtz from Maryland Matters. There really is a much smaller press corps than there used to be, even just before COVID. In the years before that, there are no longer new reporters sent here from the newspapers in, Frederick, Hagerstown, Cecil County, Salisbury, even here in Annapolis. They have a reporter who's comes down part-time, and she's also writing for the Baltimore Sun. The press pit, which is where all the solo folks from all the different newspapers used to work, it's largely the Baltimore Banner, Maryland Matters, and the Daily Record. We're often the only ones in there. And then another person or 2 might show up here or there. There used to be maybe 8, 10 different outlets represented in that room. And the good old days aren't that long ago. We're really talking, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah, I think the numbers, they are what they are. And I get that, media is a business as well as a service. And so that's an inescapable element of it. I'm not naive to that, but also like I root for this to go well and to be well served. So Banner's holding up your end of the deal, and I also support Maryland Matters and like what they do. So I think we subscribe to the Daily Record as well. So all the stakeholders who are trying to do this stuff, we're gathering information in every way we can. I will say I'm frustrated. Mako does a little bit of our own sort of aggregating and stuff on behalf of our members. Something happens in a county that we think is noteworthy, and we'll try and give them a little oxygen. But increasingly, the local papers are now behind paywalls and subscriber-only sites and so forth. So it's much more difficult to just grab a one-sentence quote and give the link so people can go read the full article themselves. We made a lot of hay out of doing that over the years, but it's increasingly difficult to try and send a reader from Prince George's County to go read this piece that happened in Cecil or in the Lower Shore or whatnot, because it's a changing environment. I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could say one more thing about losing all of the reporters from all those different communities, is nobody's doing the story anymore of, say, what do Frederick County's delegates think about changing the blueprint, right? And have their specific voices of their local, delegates and senators. When I was at the Annapolis Capital newspaper, our State House reporters did that all the time. The editors would say, poll the delegation, and you'd run down all the delegates and senators and find out where they stood on whatever the issue of the day is. And that's information people need to know to make their choices about, who they're going to vote for next time, who they're going to write an angry email to. And we're not seeing those like the Baltimore Banner. We have kind of a broad regional view. Maryland Matters is great. They have a statewide view. We're not seeing so much the accountability on the very local level because we've just lost those local reporters coming to Annapolis. And it's really, I think, a shame and a detriment to, democracy.
I endorse, co-sign, subscribe, all of the above. I'm with you. So I'll lament the direction that appears to be happening with media coverage of these things, but I will celebrate those who are still doing it and doing it well. And you're definitely on my list there. So I will say now, we had you on, I can't remember if it was a year or 2 years ago, but we had you on and you dropped some great knowledge about the world of gymnastics. So I want to take a little sidestep from Annapolis and get to your other passion, or perhaps one of your other passions. I'm sure there are many, but I know you've got a background as a gymnast and you're still a big fan. So tell me, as you know, as the lowly would be, I'd like to be interested if I just had an easier foothold, kind of would-be gymnast fan, and all of our teeming millions of listeners, what should we be paying attention to or talking about in the world of gymnastics these days?
Well, Michael, thank you for the opportunity to talk about my other great passion after journalism, which is gymnastics. I competed for many years. I still do gymnastics recreationally for fun as an adult. You're never too old to try gymnastics. Well, look, if you like following the Olympics and the Simone Biles of it all, this is a little bit of a quiet time on the world stage. We just had the Olympics last year. People are building,
Right.
looking ahead to LA 2028. I expect a lot of U.S. gymnasts to make a go for the home games. But I'm going to give you two names, two men to keep an eye on who have Maryland ties. One is Coy Young from Bowie originally. He competes at Stanford, and he's really fantastic, has won world medals. He's especially good on the pommel horse, and he's coming off an injury, but watch him going to 2028 and never sleep on my guy, Donnell Wittenberg. He's from Baltimore originally. He's also coming off an injury, but he is a world medalist. He's super fantastic on vault. He's very powerful. His muscles are huge. And he just moved to a new gym in Florida. So Donnell Wittenberg and Coy Young, watch them for the 2028. They should be in the mix if they stay healthy.
All right. So a little hometown flavor,
Yep.
some Maryland connections, but for big time stuff. And for those of us who are, for better or for worse, kind of quadrennial big fans of that sort of thing, we've got a window of time to watch Coy and Donnell advance and move their way toward Los Angeles in 28. I like
Yep.
that as a multi-year focus. I can get down for that.
And I'll give you one more too.
Ooh.
If you love the perfect 10, right? You don't get the perfect 10 anymore in Olympic gymnastics, but NCAA college gymnastics, the women still use the perfect 10. They're in the middle of their season now. They're getting their tournament is going to start in a couple weeks. It's going to be broadcast on TV. Really fast meets really dynamic, a lot of perfection and perfect 10s. And there's some former Olympians competing in NCAA gymnastics. So that's really fun. If you see it in your TV listings, definitely stop and watch. NCAA is really great.
All good. And these days, I know when my kids occasionally get into the channel surfing and open up the guide for the channels, and I grew up with bunny ears and three or four channels and that sort of thing, and now we've got we've got channels in the 3000s and 4000s and so forth. There's plenty of capacity to be carrying sporting activities that appeal to wide ranges of interest. So it doesn't just have to be NASCAR and football and baseball, but there's room for gymnastics. And I want to watch a handball game every once in a while or whatever. So we just need more of that. I like it.
Love it.
Okay, so let me wrap with one more thing. I know lots of folks in journalism like to use this, so I'll close the same way with you. What should I have asked about but didn't get around to? We've talked about the state of play in the modern coverage of policy and politics and what's happening with journalism and some fun little stories about the budget and education in Annapolis. What else should I have asked that I just didn't get to?
I think the only thing we didn't cover, Michael, is the most important bill, HB 1001, which is declaring the Orange Crush to be the state cocktail.
Would you have some words for Delaware? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I mean, look, Delaware started the war, and Maryland is on track to, strike back. The House passed the Orange Crush bill ahead of the crossover deadline, so we'll see if it makes it out of the Senate. Look, it seems to be a win-win-win. It has no fiscal cost. It's a marketing opportunity, and it gets to thumb our noses at Delaware. So
Yes,
seems
exactly.
like a winner.
Yes, that's a fool around and find out is the we'll call that the dusted off version for the podcast audience. It's good. And thanks so much for taking a little time to chat with us and with our listeners. I wish you well in these last 20 or so days of the legislative session. I hope things come together tidily on the topics you are trying to cover, and that you'll continue to nail it as you do your explaining Annapolis speak to the normal audience of human beings out there who are trying to follow this stuff. Really appreciate your time.
Michael, thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Great. Folks, that's enough for this episode of the Conduit Street Podcast. As always, if you love the podcast, and we know you do, smash that 5-star review and make sure you subscribe to get every episode sent to the device of your choice. On behalf of Pam Wood, this is Michael Sanderson, thanking our producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, and we will talk to you soon.